Today's objective is to be able to evaluate expressions with negative variables and continue to use our double parentheses. In the previous lessons, we've inputted values into our expressions, which have all been positive numbers. In today's lesson, we will now practice replacing the variable with negative numbers instead. Let's look at the example that we have here. We have n plus 5, and we want to figure out what the value of this expression is when n is equal to negative 3. The first thing that I want everyone to get into the habit of doing is adding the coefficient of 1 whenever we don't see the coefficient next to the variable. So for example, in n plus 5, before I do anything with this expression, I am first going to go ahead and take my pencil or my pen or whatever you're writing with and put a 1 next to my n. Now that I've put a 1 next to the variable that didn't show its coefficient, now I can continue doing the same steps that we've done before. We're going to rewrite our expression. We're going to replace the variable with parentheses. And in the parentheses, we're going to plug in the number that they give us. Just because it's a negative number now, it doesn't change anything about our process. So we have 1n. And again, I'm writing that 1 because it's going to play a big role when we look at different and more challenging examples later on. So we have 1n. Plus 5, and now I'm going to go ahead and replace my variable with our parentheses. So I have 1 parentheses negative 3 plus 5. And please make sure that whenever you're plugging the number into the parentheses, you are keeping its sign. So if it's a negative number, I'm putting that negative 3 inside of my parentheses. So here's how we put our expression into the calculator. And remember, I don't want you evaluating things piece by piece. I just want you to put exactly what you wrote down in your paper and put it all together into the calculator. So I have 1 parentheses negative 3, and I'm reading it as a negative, which means I need to use the negative symbol under the 3. So I have negative 3 plus 5 to give me a value of 2. So now we have the example negative n plus 5, and we want to figure out what the value of this expression is when n is equal to negative 3. So it looks very similar to the expression that we have before, with the exception that now we have a negative before the n. So again, the very first thing that you want to do is make sure that you are adding your 1 whenever you see the variable that doesn't show its coefficient next to it. So right now I'm going to go ahead and put a 1 before the n. So now the expression that I have is negative 1n plus 5. So now that I have my negative 1n plus 5, I know that the coefficient before the n is actually a negative 1. And now that I know the coefficient before n, I can actually begin to replace my variable with whatever the number of the variable actually is. So we have, again, we're going to rewrite it and replace the variable with our parentheses. So we have negative 1 parentheses negative 3 plus 5. Okay, so just because originally I had negative n plus 5 doesn't mean that I'm just going to put over here negative parentheses 3 plus 5. This is wrong. I have to keep the negative 1 that was already a part of my original expression, and I also have to keep the negative of the number that they've given us. Okay, so that's why it's very important to always make sure that you have the coefficient of the variable before you start plugging in your numbers. Now in this one, here's how we put it in the calculator.
This is the sound of greatness. Ish.
So here's how we put our second expression into the calculator. Again, I'm starting with, when I read the expression, first thing I read is negative 1. So I'm going to use the negative symbol. So negative 1, parentheses, negative 3. So negative 3, close my parentheses, plus 5 to give me a value of 8. So here's another example where our variable doesn't have a coefficient, or it doesn't show its coefficient, and we want to make sure we add it before we start plugging in. Whenever we have negatives and minuses in our expression, it's very easy to get the wrong answer if we are not adding those coefficients ourselves. So in this example, I have 3 minus x, and again, the first thing that I'm going to do before I do anything else with my expression is that I'm going to make sure that all my variables in this expression has the coefficient that it needs to have. So in this case, I'm going to add my 1 right here. And so now I can go ahead and rewrite my expression and add the parentheses wherever they're needed. So I have 3 minus 1 parentheses, and in this parentheses I can now put my negative 8. So for our third example, we want to make sure we're using negatives and minuses where they belong. So I have 3 minus 1. So 3 minus, I'm using the minus under the multiplication because I'm reading it as a minus. I didn't read negative. So 3 minus 1, parentheses, negative 8. So since I read that as a negative, I'm using the negative underneath the 3. So I have negative 8, close my parentheses, to give me a value of 11. So what do we have in this last example? We have negative x squared plus 3x minus 1. And again, I'm looking to see where in my expression I need to add any coefficients before I begin. Sometimes it might just be to one variable, to one term. Sometimes it might be to multiple terms. But in this case, I just see one variable or one term without a coefficient, which is the negative x squared. So now I'm going to go ahead and put a 1 before that x squared so that I can now begin to replace my variable with the value that I have. So I have negative 1, parentheses, I'm going to put in my negative 2, and the square, as I mentioned in previous lesson, always goes outside of the parentheses. Any exponent always goes outside of the parentheses. So I have negative 1, parentheses, negative 2 squared, plus 3, parentheses, negative 2, minus 1. Okay, so it's very important to always keep both the negative that's already there, so that negative 1, and also the negative that is now a part of the number that you are plugging in. So in this one we have, again, negative 1. It's not a minus, it's a negative 1. So I'm going to start with negative 1, parentheses, negative 2. So negative 2 square. So I'm going to use the caret up here to put in the 2. And then I'm going to use my blue arrows to come down from that exponent and write the rest of my expression. So I have plus 3, parentheses again, negative 2, not minus 2, negative 2, close my parentheses, minus 1. Since I read that as a minus, I'm going to go ahead and use the minus under the multiplication. So minus 1 to give me a value of negative 11.